It all began with a flicker across my security feed. A shadow moved near my front gate, hunched low, beige jacket catching the glow of the streetlight. At first glance, I figured it was some delivery driver wrestling a stubborn package. But then, the figure shifted upright, and there it was. The unmistakable helmet of hair, the rigid posture, and that aura of smug entitlement. Karen Miller. And those weren't garden tools she was clutching. No, in her hands gleamed a pair of industrial bolt cutters, the kind you'd expect to see hanging behind a sheet of glass labeled "break in case of doomsday." By the time I tapped into the Zoom feed, the $200 heavy-duty lock I'd installed just weeks earlier, built to resist almost anything short of dynamite, was already in jagged pieces on the driveway. Karen's grin spread across her face like she'd just solved some ancient riddle, sweat dripping down her temple as she tucked the cutters under her arm and strutted toward my Jeep, with the poise of someone who truly believed the universe. Bent to her whims, she pulled open the door and slid inside like she was claiming a prize. That victorious smirk lasted all of 12 seconds. Because just as she settled into the driver's seat, 4 unmarked police SUVs came tearing around the corner. Tires screeched, engines roared, and in a blur, a flawless law enforcement perimeter snapped into place around my property. 6 officers stepped out in unison, badges glinting, voices cutting through the night with a force that could have rattled a Navy SEAL. Karen's face drained to a shade paler than her manicured French tips. But before I tell you how beautifully this karmic showdown unfolded, let me rewind. My name is Detective Mike Rodriguez, and for the past 3 years I've called Willowbrook Heights home. It's one of those upper-middle-class neighborhoods where conformity is king. Every blade of grass must be trimmed to exactly 214 inches, mailboxes must be painted regulation black, and trash bins better not linger in sight for longer than precisely 22.5 minutes after pickup. Residents call it perfection. I call it suffocating, and at the center of this sterilized kingdom sits its self-proclaimed monarch, Karen Miller. Not just a member of the HOA, she was the HOA. She didn't enforce the bylaws, she weaponized them. For Karen, community guidelines weren't suggestions, they were commandments carved in stone. If your lawn strayed a millimeter too tall, expect a warning. If your garden gnome didn't match the approved list, prepare for a fine. She once reported a neighbor for a porch light she deemed excessively luminous after measuring it with an actual lumens meter. But her crusade against me wasn't about lawns, gnomes, or porch lights. It was about my Jeep, and to be clear, it's nothing flashy. Just a black Wrangler, clean, registered, and modified for my work with the Metro Police Task Force. It's my professional vehicle, parked legally behind my locked gate, fully compliant with every city ordinance. But in Karen's eyes, it was a barbaric intrusion, a 4-wheeled apocalypse threatening her curated sanctuary of beige siding and imported sedans. Every month without fail, I'd find another passive-aggressive violation, notice tucked under the wipers. Once, she fined me because the tires had mud on them after a rainy patrol. Another time, she claimed the spare tire was an unapproved exterior fixture. She even broke out a tape measure to check whether the antenna exceeded height restrictions. I tried diplomacy, explained politely and professionally that the IA Jeep was part of my job, kept behind my fence, and maintained spotless just to avoid drama. But Karen wasn't looking for reason. She wanted dominance. And in her mind, her HOA presidency gave her the divine right to dictate reality itself. The feud came to a head at last month's HOA meeting. Karen, standing tall at the front of a silent crowd of 30 neighbors, pointed her manicured finger at me and declared my Jeep a blight on property values. With absolute certainty, she announced she had the authority to have it removed if I didn't fall in line. I kept my cool at that HOA meeting, reminding Karen she had absolutely no authority to touch my vehicle and that she was stepping way outside her lane. That's when she gave me that look. Eyes narrowing, lips pressed thin, the silent promise of future trouble. And she delivered. In the weeks that followed, Karen escalated her crusade. I spotted her prowling my block more often than the mail carrier. She snapped photos of my Jeep from every possible angle, even climbing onto the curb across the street to peer over my fence. She slipped handwritten notes into my mailbox, rambling about community integrity and civic duty. She even whipped out a tape measure to record the exact distance between my bumper and the gate. The breaking point came in the frozen food aisle of the grocery store. She cornered me beside the bags of peas, flashed a reptilian smile, and announced she'd found a loophole in the HOA bylaws. According to her interpretation, abandoned vehicles could be removed from private property. I told her point blank my Jeep was far from abandoned. She leaned in and whispered, "We'll see about that." That's when I decided it was time to stop playing defense. I reinforced the gate with a high-grade lock, installed extra cameras, and tied the live feed into the department's monitoring system. I wasn't just protecting my Jeep, I was laying bait. Here's the piece Karen never knew. While she was plotting her little heist, I was neck-deep in a massive narcotics case. My task force had been grinding through 16-hour days trying to shut down a heroin pipeline into the city. I was running on caffeine and fumes. But when that alert pinged, someone tampering with my gate, I dropped everything. I excused myself from an interview, called it in immediately, and identified the situation for what it was: a civilian attempting to steal a law enforcement vehicle from a detective's residence. Within minutes, backup was rolling. Karen, bless her oblivious heart, thought she was untouchable. She cut through that $200 lock like she was pruning roses, tossed the shards into the bushes, and even did a smug little victory shimmy that would have been funny if it weren't so brazen. Then she climbed into my Jeep, radiating triumph, and that's when the trap snapped shut. 4 unmarked SUVs roared in from the corner, lights dark but engines furious, followed by 2 marked cruisers that flipped their sirens on at the last second. Officers poured out, surrounding my property with precision. Karen froze in place. The smirk vanished. Her jaw went slack. Officer Janet Martinez, my task force partner, approached first, badge raised, voice cutting sharp as a blade, ordering Karen to exit the vehicle with her hands visible. Karen blinked like a fish pulled out of water, stammering wordless protests before finally climbing out. And then, in a move only Karen could make, she launched into one of her infamous HOA sermons. She proclaimed she had full authority, that this was simply a neighborhood matter, that she was protecting property values. That's when I stepped outside, badge in hand, and calmly informed her she had just attempted to steal a government vehicle. You could see the realization crash down on her. Her skin turned as pale as her French tips. By then, at least 20 neighbors had gathered, forming a silent audience on their lawns. They watched as Karen's empire collapsed in real time. She tried spinning it, claiming she was merely relocating the Jeep, that she had paperwork, that it was all a civil misunderstanding. She even framed it as being a good neighbor. But Martinez wasn't having it. She laid it out clear. Breaking into private property, cutting through a commercial lock, and entering a vehicle without consent wasn't neighborhood oversight. It was criminal trespass. It was attempted grand theft auto, and because the vehicle belonged to law enforcement, the charges carried even more weight. The cuffs went on in my driveway. Karen shrieked about her rights, about harassment, about knowing important people, but her voice was drowned out by the Miranda warning. She was loaded into the back of a cruiser as the neighborhood looked on. The fallout was immediate. She was charged with trespassing, attempted grand theft, destruction of property, and interference with an active investigation. The DA wanted to make an example of her. If convicted, she was staring down 3 years behind bars. The next day, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. Karen tried to storm in, insisting on her right to defend herself, but the board had already reviewed the police report and my camera footage. The vote was swift and unanimous, 8-0, with 1 nervous abstention. Karen was officially removed as president. When the decision was announced, she erupted, screaming that they were betraying her, that she was the only one protecting their property values, that they'd regret it. But the room stayed silent. No one stood up for her. And in that heavy quiet, as her voice cracked and her bravado dissolved, it was clear. The reign of Karen Miller was over. So if you enjoyed this serving of suburban justice, piping hot and perfectly satisfying, don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable neighborhood sagas that prove reality will always outdo fiction. Drop a like, share this story, and tell me in the comments if you've ever faced off with a Karen of your own. I read every single one. And remember, lawns may be trimmed, hedges may be perfect, but the drama in the suburbs is always wildly overgrown.